Kant was an unremitting and enthusiastic theorist of race. During the so-called Silent Decade, from 1770 to 1780, where Kant was unusually inactive in publication in the lead-up to the critical period of his philosophy that began with the first critique, namely in the year 1781, he nevertheless published once, and that was on race. Kant developed his race theory in a trilogy of essays of the different races of human beings, the determination of the concept of human race, and finally in 1788 on the use of teleological principles in philosophy. Kant republished his essays on race unchanged repeatedly in the 1790s and all three essays at once in 1797 and 1799. Throughout his lecturing career until the year 1796, he offered almost 50 lectures on physical geography, which partly deals with the racial and ethnic divisions of humankind. Kant's theory of race is not only a theory about the nature of race, but also contains normative racial claims. He notoriously puts forward and at times emphatically defends a set of racist beliefs about non-whites. Take, by the way of evidence, just the following two statements from the same years, namely 1785 and 1788, he published his two major works on universalistic moral philosophy. I quote, Americans and N, by the way, I'm not going to spell out the N word, Americans and N are each a race sunk beneath the remaining members of the human species in their mental dispositions, unquote. And that the race of Amerindians, quote, is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, and incapable of any culture, and ranks still far below even the N, who stands on the lowest of all the other steps that we have named as differences of the races. Since the 1990s, there has been an ongoing debate about Kant's race theory, especially with focus on its normative aspects, on whether and to what extent he or his theory as an integral part of the canonical body of the philosophical thought was racist or influenced the course of racism. A separate, intense metaphysical debate on the nature of race has been taking place since the 1990s as well, raising questions about what kind of entity race is, whether race is real, if so, what is the nature of its reality, and so on. In my lecture today, I connect these two debates. In light of recent accounts of the metaphysical status of race, I will explore what kind of race metaphysics Kant developed. Although such an endeavor would benefit both scholarly debates of Kant and contemporary race philosophy, it has been widely neglected. While Kant scholars and a few critical race theorists who also concern themselves with Kant focus on the significance of the racist beliefs in his philosophy or the historical effects they have had, it has not been duly recognized that Kant's metaphysics of race, as I aim to show today, is a unique or at least distinct metaphysical position. As a result, not only in the contemporary map of race metaphysics, not only is the contemporary map of race metaphysics incomplete, but it also often remains unnoticed whence the racist claims and implications in Kant's race theory spring. Looking at Kant's race theory in comparison with other metaphysical positions on race may contribute, moreover, to capturing both some of the aspects of his theory and new dimensions of metaphysical racism which have not yet been fully perceived. However, the main goal I pursue today is classificatory, though not without normative upshots. I argue that Kant's account of race, whether it is a wrong account or not, represent a distinct position which the contemporary classifications of race metaphysics has not yet mapped, and so that we should extend the landscape of race metaphysics by recognizing this new position. Before it gets started, I would like to clarify my understanding of two key terms in today's lecture. Firstly, I use racism mainly to refer to the theory of race Kant developed, rather than to his personal motives, attitudes, beliefs, actions, and so on. Secondly, I use the term metaphysics in the following sense. Kant himself has a peculiar conception of metaphysics. In a general sense, it refers to all pure philosophy, including the critique of reason. Metaphysics in this comprehensive sense is then divided into the metaphysics of speculative and practical use of pure reason. The former is then metaphysics in the narrow sense, according to Kant, which is again subdivided, with transcendental philosophy as one part of it. Transcendental philosophy, again, is named by Kant ontology in what he calls that term's genuine sense, which consists only of reason. According to Kant, a proper metaphysic, or as he says, philosophy in a genuine sense, in distinction from all metaphysics before Kant, has transcendental philosophy, as is propedeutic. I understand metaphysics as it pertains to race in a very simple way as a theoretical engagement with questions about the being and the nature of reality of race. This usage, however, does not deviate from Kant's own understanding of the metaphysics in its narrow, genuine sense and its application to race. But conceive my term metaphysics in this talk at many places as we use it today in the literature on race, in the sense of the ontology of race. So, now here's how I proceed. First, I provide an overview of the landscape of race metaphysics, which will serve then to locate Kant's position as well as to display its differences from and similarities with other metaphysical positions of race. Second, I outline Kant's account of race according to his three essays on race. Apart from my discussion of Kant's first essay on race, which is from in the first edition 1775 and the second edition 1777, I will be focused on the critical period of his philosophy, and except for one quotation on works published by Kant himself. Third, I will deal with the special features of the kind of metaphysics that lies behind Kant's account of race. And in the final part of my talk, I offer a detailed contrast of Kant's metaphysics of race, which I shall label race-tilier rationalism, with other positions in the metaphysics of race. If we ask how Kant fared when we look at the current positions on race, the prospects are dim, and rightly so. Contemporary positions that I read years later are radically anti-racist. Kant's race theory, although I leave it open today, seems by contrast to be inescapably a racist theory. It does not follow, however, that today's classification of theories of race does not need to accommodate Kant's position. And one reason is the following. If it is true that Kant's race metaphysics marks a distinct domain, and if it is right that Kant's race theory is a racist theory, then Kant's race metaphysics presents or backs a genuine form of racism which needs to be accounted for, to learn from, and to avoid it or its possible variants. So let me begin with the landscape of race metaphysics, the contemporary taxonomy of metaphysics of race. This is just a brief outline of the main positions, metaphysical positions of race. The two main camps in the metaphysics of race are race anti-realism, which denies the reality of race, and race realism, which affirms it. Race realists differ from each other regarding what kind of reality they think race has. A version of race realism is race naturalism, sometimes called biological realism, which considers race to be a natural kind or a natural property, that is, something that reflects the natural world independent of human beings, rather than reflecting their interactions or being mind-dependent. Two examples of race, natural realist view about race are traditional racialism, which assumed that races are biobehavioral essences out there, i.e., we're supposed to explain not only biological, but also differences in intellectual, moral, or cultural abilities. The 19th century race accounts are the typical examples of this position. And on the other hand, the contemporary anti-essentialist racial population naturalism, which conceives of races in terms of populations defended by a certain degree of reproductive isolation. A natural view of race, however, is not necessarily linked to race realism. The rationale of some anti-realists who deems race a natural kind of property goes as something like this. If there were any races, they would be natural kinds of properties, but there is no natural kind of property that could be matched with what we call race. So a naturalist view about race is not committal on whether races factually exist or not. And at any rate, it is widely agreed that races as biological essences do not exist. Another major cluster of positions within race realism regards the reality of race as a social kind, generated, reinforced, and upheld by interactions of human beings. For example, how we group, recognize, and address people, the way we treat and judge each other, social roles we distribute and occupy, institutionalized ideas and practices, and so on. On these, today's most popular views, race is a socio-historical construct. Race constructionism is not monolithic. But race constructionists, for all their differences, not only agree that races as a social kind are real, they also understand their existence as involving some normative aspects. Race constructionism and race naturalism are not mutually exclusive. There are positions maintaining that both are true, or that they are not incompatible. Moreover, there are different anti-realist positions that reject the reality of race both as natural and social kind. In sum, race realists differ from each other regarding what kind of reality race has, whereas race realism and anti-realism differ with regard to the existence of race in the outer world. This is a rough map of the metaphysical positions on race. The main areas are fixed and agreed upon and seem to be exhaustive, even if they might overlap in various nuanced ways and even though terminology might vary. But does Kant's metaphysic of race fit onto this map? Kant is a monogenist. He believes that all human beings, despite their differences, belong to the same species, i.e., are of one and the same single phylum, Stamm. This is evident by virtue of our interfertility. A key claim that Kant, however, makes is that certain forms of heredity are not contingent. Kant introduces and determines the concept of race to make them that subtle, specific, natural difference between humans incomprehensible, which is, as he believes, non-contingently hereditary. And here you have one of the standard definitions of the term race in Kant's theory. The concept of a race is therefore a classificatory difference of the animals of one and the same phylum insofar as this difference is unfailingly, unausbleiblich hereditary. But how does race fulfill this task? This happens in Kant's theory with reference to 4 skin colors: white, black, copper red, and olive yellow. Kant thinks that these skin colors mark the unfailingly hereditary radical peculiarity, as he says, of the various races. We observe, according to Kant, that the four differences in skin color are the only ones among the hereditary characters that are unfailingly hereditary. The four principal skin colors are in turn the results of certain developmental processes. These are an interplay of, on the one hand, internal factors in a hypothetical original shape of the human species before races came into being, and external environmental factors, most importantly, the influence of air and sun on the other hand. The internal factors are called germs, Keime, and natural predispositions, natürliche Anlagen. Kant assumes that the hypothetical original human beings who preceded the development of races must have been, I quote, destined for all climates and every soil, unquote. Thus, germs and natural predispositions to all racial differences must have lain necessarily ready in a single first phylum so that the latter would be suitable for the gradual population of the different regions of the world. Germs and predispositions are, in other words, potentialities in original human beings, waiting to be, I quote, either unfolded or restrained, unquote, by external environmental conditions. Race is hence conceived against the teleological backdrop of nature's care for the preservation of the species. But one gets a clearer picture of Kant's conception of race by focusing on some central claims in his theory that, by all indications, have normative character. Although Kant concedes in his first essay on race that, I quote, one cannot hope to find, unquote, the original pre-racial human shape unchanged anywhere in the world now, he nevertheless speculates that the whites of brunette color should be the closest to it. Moreover, by reference to the original pre-racial human shape, he points a racial ladder which is organized by skin color and some environmental factors. A ladder which descends as the following. First race, blondes, North Europeans, from humid cold weather. Second race, copper reds, from dry cold. Third race, blacks, from humid heat. And fourth race, olive yellow, from dry heat. Kant becomes more explicit about the hierarchical order from second to fourth races in his other essays and lectures. Due to their closeness to the original, this raceless shape, Kant puts, due to their closeness to the original, raceless shape, Kant puts brunette whites at the top of his racial ladder. His argument for this runs as follows. Kant assumes that the zone 31st to the 52nd degree of latitude of Earth, including, for example, most parts of Europe, or what he calls the ancient world, is a region in which the most fortunate mixture of environmental factors and the greatest riches in creatures of the earth are found. He continues that this region must be where also the human beings has diverged the least from his original formation, given that he's equally well prepared for all transplantings from there. Now, so Kant, if we look at the inhabitants of this region, what we find in here mostly are brunette whites. Let me call this the closeness to the original thesis. Excuse me. Which means the closer to the original pre-racial shape of human beings who were white, the higher the racial status. But note that Kant drops this thesis at the end of his second essay on race. Kant's conception of race contains furthermore the following central idea. Once a race like the current one has established itself through the long residence of its original people in certain regions, this race could not be transformed into another one through any further influences of the climate. Once a race has taken root and has suffocated the other germs, it resists all transformation. Kant defends this idea throughout his trilogy of race. And this is not accidental, since the essential part of his determining the concept of race is that it makes the permanent hereditary difference between human beings comprehensible. If therefore the irreversibility of race in Kant's account were abandoned, the whole project of his conceptual determination would collapse. Let me call the position that races cannot be transformed in the above way the irreversibility thesis. Once a race is founded, it remains always the same. The other germs and predispositions will be once for all incapacitated, regardless how the climate changes. In his final essay on race, Kant also elaborates on another aspect of his accounts of race, which is often neglected by Kant scholars. The racial development of some groups of human beings might pause if the interaction of their natural predispositions with their climate goes awry, resulting in an incomplete actualization of their predispositions. To begin with, Kant claims that the main purpose of nature is complete adaptation to a climate. Once germs have already begun to develop, nature would even hinder them from developing if they move to a different climate, especially if this move be from a warm climate to a cold one. Kant goes on to speculate that if a small group in the old world, in a decisive period of the development of their predispositions, were to move, for example, from southern regions to a northeastern region, predispositions that were about to be actualized for adaptation to the former regions, I quote, must have gradually come to a standstill, unquote. Kant also assumes here that it would not help the racial group to re-migrate to its original environmental context. Thus, I quote, a race would have been founded which is not suited to any climate, since the southern adaptation prior to its departure was interrupted halfway through and exchanged against an adaptation to the northern climate, unquote. Kant takes some inhabitants of America to represent this racial underdevelopment, as their natural predispositions, I quote, did not achieve a perfect suitability for any climate, unquote. Let me call this the racial underdevelopment thesis, which means certain races, in a broad sense, remain due to incomplete actualization of germs and predispositions underdeveloped. And this continues is the reason why this race, which is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, and incapable of any culture, ranks still far below even the N, who stands on the lowest of all other steps that we have named as differences of the races. Kant's irreversibility and racial underdevelopment thesis presuppose a number of a priori premises. I will go through just some of them here. The first one is the premise of the unilaterality of the actualization of predispositions. That means once a predisposition begins to be actualized, its developmental path cannot be reversed. Secondly, the necessary continuity of each actualization, which means the actualization of predisposition cannot change or pause within their social developmental path and then resume the original process. And third, the zero-sum game of actualizing predispositions. That means the actualization of one germ or a set of germs, whether complete or incomplete, comes at the cost of preventing the actualization of the other. This whole theory of race comes up with does not describe nature, but rather gives an account of the development of nature for the understanding, as Kant says. It is part of what he calls the natural history, Naturgeschichte, of the human species, which is not the cognition of natural things, as Kant says, as they are now, but a reconstructive, cognition of that which they once were and of the series of changes they underwent to arrive at each place in their present state. To do this, we must, Kant states, acknowledge that the universal mechanical laws would be at some point of no help. We should rather, I quote, adduce purposive causes where the natural causes are not easily recognizable. In the first and second essays on race, and still more carefully in his third, Kant emphasizes that his race theory is a teleological account referring only to such ends that can be also known through experience. The underlying claim is that there is a warrant, befugness, indeed a need of reason, to start from a teleological principle where theory, insofar as it is based on experience, abandons us. The second essay on race, which characterizes the methods of Kant's race theory as the use of reason in natural sciences, is pretty much clear about this. Kant is actually here unmistakable in his aim to determine the concept of race, I quote, before questioning experience about it, unquote. Or, in other words, to make out a priori his concept following the maxim of reason. Kant thus presents a teleological, rationalistic theory of race. This is indeed the major point of his third essay, which was largely a reply to Georg Forster, who, according to Kant, misunderstood his methodology, which is that his account of race is based on reason's teleological principle and its role in the examination of nature, more specifically in the hypothetical natural history. Let me move on to the third part of my talk, namely the special features of Kant's race metaphysics. So the question is, what kind of metaphysics lies behind this conception of race? I remind you that my understanding of the term is rather, the term metaphysics is rather connected with the contemporary meaning, which does not at the same time deviate from Kant's conception of metaphysics in the narrow sense. As we have seen, Kant's account of race is unambiguously teleological, but it does not follow the sort of teleology we encountered before him, positing certain ends in nature independent of human beings. In a key passage of his third essay on race, Kant provides an illuminating characterization of the nature of race in his theory. What is race? The word does not figure in a system of the description of nature. Therefore, presumably, the thing itself is nowhere in nature either. Yet the concept designated by this expression is well grounded in the reason of each observer of nature. The fact that this word does not occur in the description of nature cannot prevent the observer of nature from finding it necessary with respect to natural history, unquote. To explain this passage appropriately, a brief look at the second part of Kant's critique of the power of judgment from 1790, with its second part titled as Critique of the Teleological Power of Judgment, is helpful. Although the third critique is published after Kant's race trilogy, it nevertheless provides the metaphysical foundation for his conception of race. My aim, though, in this part will be only to highlight some specific features of Kant's teleology of nature. Moreover, a full treatment of Kant's teleology requires much more discussion than I could possibly offer today. For example, the relationship between the third critique and the first critique, especially the part called Appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic. However, my main argument about the characteristics of Kant's metaphysics of race will not be affected by this incompleteness. And a final short note regarding Kant's race trilogy in connection with the critique of the teleological judgment has a long history among Kantian scholars. So, Kant's late teleology of nature is inextricably linked with his account of the power of judgment. Being an intermediary between pure understanding and pure reason in the family of the higher faculties of cognition, as Kant says, the power of judgment is an integral part of Kant's conception of reason in the broad sense, namely as opposed to sensibility or the empirical. The power of judgment in general is the faculty for thinking of the relationship between the particular and the universal. In Kant's account, there are two main operations of this power. They differ depending whether, I quote, the universal, the rule, the principle, the law is given or not. Now, if only the particular is given for which the universal is to be found, then the power of judgment is, according to Kant, merely the reflecting. As Kant states, the reflecting power of judgment, which I will call from now on RPJ, ascends from the particular in nature to the universal. It is the RPJ that lies at the core of Kant's teleology of nature and therefore natural history, under which his theory of race falls. One of Kant's main claims in the third critique is that the RPJ, like pure understanding and pure reason, has its own a priori transcendental principle, which is furthermore regulative, namely the principle of the purposiveness of nature, by which alone we sensible rational beings can comprehend the order of nature in accordance with empirical laws. In Kant's transcendental philosophy, pure understanding gives a priori laws pertaining only to the possibility of nature as an object of the senses in general. However, many modifications of the universal transcendental concepts of nature are left undetermined by those laws. This is the case regarding particular empirical laws in their relation to each other. How their manifoldness could be captured under certain unity is therefore still an open question for Kant. Kant argues then that the RPJ is that part of reason which is responsible for how this manifoldness is to be captured. Now, the undetermined relations between particular empirical laws, Kant states, must be considered, I quote, in terms of the sort of unity they would have, as if an understanding had given them for the sake of our faculty of cognition. This idea then serves as a principle for the RPJ, which Kant calls purposiveness of nature in its multiplicity. The power of judgment uses this principle to reflect on the relation of appearances in nature in light of their ends, for example, the end of the preservation of kites. Kant marks the principle of purposiveness transcendental since it represents the universal a priori condition under which alone certain aspects of nature can become objects of our condition. However, the principle of purposiveness is not a surrogate for the explanatory mechanical causal laws of nature. The idea is that we, in addition to and complementary to seeking mechanical causal explanation, must reflect on natural phenomena and their relationship as if they had an internal purposiveness. So the purposiveness of nature, strictly speaking, does not explain nature. Moreover, the principle of purposiveness is not constitutive to nature. We do not ascribe purposiveness to nature, Kant says, but are only guided by it in our inquiries about nature. It is a regulative principle. So it attributes nothing at all to the object of nature, but rather only represents the unique way in which we must proceed in reflection on the objects of nature. The RPJ is furthermore an a priori legislative faculty. However, it can only give itself such a transcendental principle as a law. The RPJ, Kant writes, prescribes a law to itself, for reflection on nature. In this sense, the purposiveness of nature is a subjective principle. It does not say what happens, it does not describe. The principle rather says how natural phenomena for subjects like us, I quote, ought to be judged, unquote. The subjectivity of the principle does not mean that its validity is not universally objective. Kant advocates a peculiar form of strict objectivism here. As a condition of the possibility of cognition of objects of nature, the transcendental principle of purposiveness possesses the highest level of objectivity for all rational beings like humans. Even though it cannot be regarded as existing in nature, it makes, as an a priori regulative principle, universal and necessary propositions about products of nature. This specific form of objectivism has its source in reason, even though it could only be applied to empirical data. So, this is the metaphysics behind Kant's conception of race. Our reason, which is in Kant's view in search of order and unity in nature, needs to make the relation between natural commonality and diversity among human beings comprehensible. It avails itself of its own teleological judgment, guiding its research into natural history. What operates here specifically is the RPJ as an integral part of reason with its transcendental regulative principle of purposiveness at the highest level of objectivity. As Kant unambiguously clarifies in the above-mentioned key passage of his third essay on race, race itself is presumably nowhere in nature, yet the concept designated by this expression is well grounded in the reason. In a word, race is mainly a product of reason projected, as it were, unto nature. I would like to call Kant's race metaphysics race teleorationalism. It is teleological in the sense that it results from the application of the transcendental principle of purposiveness to the natural history of human species. And I label it rationalism because it sees race as a product of or residing in reason rather than nature or social, political, or cultural interactions. It is indeed Kant's main complaint in both race essays of the critical period that his critics failed to see his teleo-rational approach to race. Let me move on to the final part of my talk. At a first glance, one might think that Kant is an anti-realist or a nominalist about race, since he states that race presumably is nowhere in nature. But this would oversimplify matters. Although teleorationalism sees races as, so to speak, mind-dependent, or more precisely dependent about the regulative standpoint of reason, Kant's critical transcendental philosophy demands, in a sophisticated way, silence about the possible substratum reality beneath race and its relation to it. For Kant, race exists objectively for and among all rational agents of cognition. It refers also at the empirical level to something real that is necessarily hereditary. Kant observes it through certain skin colors and, as it is well known, discriminates for and against certain racial groups. Nor is the teleorational account of race a variant of race constructionism. For Kant, race is not a contingent socio-historical reality created by interactions of human beings. It is not up to us to construct races differently or give up on them. On the teleorational account, races are rather entities necessitated and projected onto natural history by reason. Race teleorationalism and race constructionists both place the source of the validity of race in human beings. But while race constructionism claims that our concept of race derives from particularities of time and space, race teleorationalism is distinguished by claiming that race has a specific a priori ground. Race teleorationalism is not a version of A, traditional, or B, contemporary race naturalism either. Let me begin with A. Kant does not regard races as biological essences as traditional naturalists did. It is worth noting that race essentialism has though often been attributed to Kant, and this is a mistake. Naomi Zak, to quote one prominent race scholar, writes that Kant believed in Aristotelian constitutive essences for racial groups and thought that such essences were the likely subject of science. This meant that he thought he had knowledge of what Locke would have called real essences of race. But there are at least two reasons why race cannot for Kant be an Aristotelian essence or a Lockean real essence. First, races could, on Kant's account, completely melt together, as he says, zusammenschmelzen, after a number of generations in mixed races, even if Kant says nature dislikes this. In the second essay on race, Kant states, for instance, that it is, I quote, certain that the currently existing races could not no longer go extinct if all their mixing with each other were prevented, unquote. It therefore seems possible, though not desirable, that those whose ancestors went through multiple mixing cannot be assigned a race, at least none of the four color-coded main races in Kant's theory. Secondly, the original human being in Kant's natural history is still raceless, as it carries, as Kant says, in itself all germs united awaiting actualization. Racial diversity is both prior to the development of races and after sufficient race mixing absent. With other words, racelessness is in Kant's race metaphysics possible. Note in addition that in Kant's natural history, it is also accidental which race one becomes, as well as whether the respective race is completed or underdeveloped. In sum, in race telerationalism, having any specific race is contingent and there is place for pre- and post-racial human beings, although race itself is, in a Kantian regulative sense, a subjectively necessary way of making sense of the unity and diversity of human species. Let me go to the second version of naturalism, namely the contemporary version. Race telerationalism is not a version of this contemporary variant of biological account of race. As Kant is applying the regulative principle of purposiveness to the natural history of the human species, he's not assessing the reality of race assigning the reality of race to nature. For him, race is not something that we discover, it rather guides our observation and inquiry into nature. His account also importantly deviates from the so-called population naturalists, who, despite their differences, identify races as reproductively isolated breeding populations. Aside from the fact that race is for Kant not a natural kind of property, the variants of population naturalism are based on empirical data and methods about human evolutionary history. Ironically, though, Kant's natural history is, in a sense, even ahistorical. His historical reconstruction is not primarily based on empirical data. Kant's genealogy of race is a story told by reason. Kant surely takes certain a posteriori natural kinds to be a confirmation of his race theory, or his a priori framework, most importantly, the skin color. But this does not mean that race is biologically real or revealed by natural science. As sensible, rational beings, we rather avail ourselves of natural kinds or properties when the transcendental regulative principle of purposiveness is applied to natural history. So let me summarize. Race telerationalism is not an essentialist realist theory but a regulative objectivist theory of race for all rational beings. It stands alongside anti-realism, race constructionism, and race naturalism as a distinct metaphysical position on race. Let me bring my talk to a close with some further normative remarks and comparisons. Kant's efforts and conjectures invoking allegedly empirical evidence are guided by the principle of purposiveness in nature and at the same time are normatively knowledgeable. Consider these few examples. In the first essay on race, 7077, second edition, he writes that the dissolution of iron in the blood of the whites, as opposed to red, black, and yellow skin groups, attests that the whites carry the perfect mixture of the fluids in their bodies and their strength ahead of others. The white race arose in an environment in which the most fortunate mixture of influences of colder and hotter regions and also the greatest riches in creatures of the earth are found. In the second essay on race from 1785, he writes that since the true N race lives in the regions in which the air is so phlogistized through thick forest and swamp-covered regions, it was an arrangement very wisely made by nature to organize their skin such that the blood could dephlogistize itself much more strongly through the skin than is the case with us, i.e. white people. This would be the reason for the, I quote, strong odor of the N which cannot be helped through any cleanness. And in his third essay on race from 1788 and republished in 1797 and 1799, Kant writes that N and gypsies, who were for Kant Indians, lack an immediate drive to activity, especially to the sustained activity that one calls industry, Emsichkeit, which is especially interwoven with certain natural predispositions. Finally, consider the following in his lecture on physical geography from the year 1792, in which he says, in the torrid zones, humans mature more quickly in all aspects than in the temperate zones, but they fail to reach the same degree of perfection. Humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The N are much lower, and the lowest of all is part of the American races. At the beginning of his second essay on the determination of the concept of race, Kant writes, "It is of great consequence to have previously determined the concept that one wants to elucidate through observation before questioning experience about it. For one finds in experience what one needs only if one knows in advance what to look for." And indeed, this is what occurs in Kant's account of race. The allegedly empirical evidence above is not just false and or based on biased empirical assumptions which lead to Kant's accounts of race. The direction is the other way around. The teleological ideas that some races are within the framework of a complete actualization better off, that some races are counter-purposive like some Amerindians, as they fall prey to an incomplete actualization, and that all this is unchangeable, irreversible, are what attract the alleged evidence. It is the teleo-rational determination of the concept which seeks empirical support, such as phlogiston, with normative implication. I note here that phlogiston was in 1780s a highly, deeply controversial element among scientists, even at Kant's time. I said in 1780s. Because after Antoine Lavoisier's experience, it turned out to be non-existent. And it's kind of astonishing that Kant ignores these scientific facts of his own time. Well, all the above mentioned contemporary metaphysical positions acknowledged and condemned the reality of racism. But we cannot find such a recognition in Kant's theory of race, even though we would expect it, especially regarding its simultaneity with his universalistic moral theory. Put simply, whilst the contemporary positions fight racism, Kant's account feeds it. And finally, race teleorationalism and traditional racialism share certain features. They both set and perpetuate unchangeable racial limits to individuals. But as I have argued, they are not to be confounded with each other. While traditional racialism supposes correlations between race and certain intellectual and moral features by reference to natural essences, race teleorationalism allows similar judgments by way of a non-explanatory, that is, regulative, rationalized model for making natural history of humankind comprehensible. So, I have been arguing for taking Kant's metaphysics of race seriously. This is important to critically demarcate what racist aspects could be attributed to the race account which Kant has developed. My goal has been to show that Kant's metaphysics of race is a distinct position, which I have called race teleorationalism. But I left open what inherently racist claims this theory possesses and reinforces. The comparisons that I have made with other accounts should contribute to completing the map of metaphysical's positions on race and their racist aspects, as well as casting light on some features of Kant's race theory itself, which have been neglected so far. Thank you very much.